State of Oklahoma executes a convicted murderer in McAllister. Kendrick Simpson was executed by lethal injection at the state penitentiary just a few hours ago. A vigil was held outside for him of the governor's mansion simultaneously. Simpson was sentenced to death for the 2006 murders of Glenn Palmer and Anthony Jones. Both their families and Attorney General Gentner Drummond supported the execution. Simpson's attorneys argued that he suffered years of trauma and abuse, which they said was not considered during his trial. Attorney General Drummond, writing in a statement this afternoon, in part, quote, "Justice has been served for Glenn Palmer and Anthony Jones. Their young lives were taken tragically and far too soon."
On February 12, 2026, inside the execution chamber at Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAllister, Kendrick Simpson lay strapped to a gurney beneath fluorescent lights that had witnessed dozens of deaths before his. At 10:19 in the morning, the three-drug cocktail began flowing into his veins through tubes that disappeared into the wall where an executioner he would never see pushed the plungers. Midazolam to render him unconscious. Vecuronium bromide to paralyze his lungs. Potassium chloride to stop his heart. He was 45 years old, 19 years removed from the night that destroyed 5 families and ended 2 lives over a red baseball cap and a bruised ego. Through the glass, witnesses watched. Some came for justice. Some came for closure. Some came hoping his death would finally silence the images that played in their minds every night since January 16, 2006. Glenn Palmer was 20 years old when he died. Anthony Jones was 19. They were sitting in the front seats of Palmer's Chevrolet Caprice, probably still talking about the confrontation at Fritzy's nightclub, probably wondering if they should have just left when things got tense, probably not realizing they were being followed by a white Monte Carlo that stayed 3 car lengths back for over 3 miles. When approximately 20 rounds from an SKS assault rifle tore through the metal and glass and flesh, they had no time to react. Simpson pulled the trigger and kept pulling it, emptying the magazine into the car until his finger hurt and his ears rang, and Palmer's Caprice crashed into a pole and went silent. He had followed them through the dark streets of Oklahoma City with rage building in his chest with every turn, paranoia screaming in his traumatized mind that disrespect meant death, and he had to strike first or die trying, convinced with absolute certainty that these young men were hunting him just like the shooters who nearly killed him in New Orleans 2 years earlier. In the back seat, London Johnson ducked low and survived, his ears destroyed by the gunfire, his clothes soaked in his best friend's blood. In the front seats, Glenn Palmer and Anthony Jones bled out before the car even finished settling against the pole. And when the gunfire stopped and the smoke cleared and Simpson realized what he had done, he yelled into the night, satisfied and terrified and alive, calling himself a monster. Because somewhere deep down, he knew that's exactly what he had become. But to understand how a boy born into violence, raised by addiction, abused without intervention, shot in the head at 16, nearly killed at 24, traumatized by Katrina, became a double murderer who transformed himself on death row into an award-winning poet who expressed genuine remorse but still died for what he did, we have to go back. Back to 1980. Back to the very beginning of Kendrick Simpson. If you are drawn to stories where justice collides with trauma, where even redemption meets consequence, make sure to subscribe to No Way Out. This is where true crime meets truth. Real cases, real consequences. The darkest corners of human decision, broken down in bits, so you can see every detail, every turning point, every moment that mattered, and decide for yourself what justice really means. Kendrick Antonio Simpson was born in New Orleans in 1980. His mother was 16 years old when she gave birth to him. His father left before he arrived and never returned. The young mother struggled with crack cocaine addiction during the years that followed. They lived in the lower 9th Ward housing projects, a place where violence shaped daily life. The apartment complex where Simpson spent his earliest years sat in one of New Orleans' most dangerous neighborhoods. Gunshots echoed through the projects regularly. Bodies appeared on the grounds after shootings. Stabbings happened in plain view. Drug dealers operated openly from corners and doorways. Prostitution flourished in the shadows. Simpson witnessed these scenes before he reached school age. His mother's addiction worsened as the years passed. Money meant for food and rent disappeared. The utilities got shut off frequently. Simpson learned to fend for himself when his mother vanished for days at a time. Neighbors sometimes fed him when they noticed he hadn't eaten. Other times, he went hungry. Simpson attended public schools when his mother remembered to send him. He fell behind academically. Teachers struggled to maintain order in overcrowded classrooms. Many students came from similar situations. The system failed to provide adequate support. Simpson drifted through grades without learning basic skills. At home, chaos reigned. His mother brought different men to the apartment. Some stayed for weeks. Others disappeared after a night. Violence erupted during arguments. Simpson hid in closets when fights broke out. He learned to recognize the signs of coming trouble. A family member began sexually abusing Simpson when he turned 11. The abuse continued for years. He told no one about what happened. The perpetrator threatened him into silence. Simpson carried the trauma without help or intervention. No adults noticed the changes in his behavior. No one asked questions. The neighborhood's influence grew stronger as Simpson entered his teenage years. Simpson's education suffered from constant disruption. He moved between schools when his mother changed apartments to avoid rent. Each transfer meant starting over socially and academically. Teachers had no continuity with his progress. He stopped trying to keep up with coursework. The streets provided more immediate lessons about survival. By his mid-teenage years, Simpson had fathered 2 sons. He was 16 when the second one arrived. The responsibilities of fatherhood landed on someone who remained a teenager himself. He had no job skills and no education beyond elementary reading levels. The cycle of poverty that trapped his mother now held him too. The teenage years passed in a blur of survival. Each day brought new challenges: finding food, avoiding violence, making money, staying alive. Simpson developed the hypervigilance that comes from constant danger. He learned to read situations quickly. The skills would shape his responses for years to come. 16 years old in 1996, Simpson faced a problem with no good solution. 2 young sons needed support, and his mother's addiction meant she provided nothing. Money problems crushed down from every angle. Legitimate work existed somewhere in the world, but not for someone with no education and no skills. The streets offered the only path he could see. He connected with other teenagers looking for fast money in a city that offered few legal ways to get it. Together, they scouted potential targets around New Orleans. Small businesses caught their attention, vulnerable operations running on thin margins. An electronics repair shop stood out. The owner worked alone, and the neighborhood met police response would be slow. They formulated a plan that seemed simple enough. On an otherwise ordinary day in 1997, Simpson walked through the door of that repair shop carrying a gun. Behind the counter stood Hung Pham, 43 years old, operating the business he'd built by himself. Simpson demanded the money from the register. Pham moved carefully to comply with the armed teenager's orders. What happened next crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The robbery escalated into something far more violent. Simpson forced his way deeper into the shop and began beating Pham savagely across the face and back. Even after Pham surrendered his wallet, the violence continued. Simpson forced the terrified man down to his knees on the floor. Then he raised the gun and fired directly into Pham's head. The bullet struck Pham's ear. He collapsed bleeding onto the floor of his own shop, but somehow his heart kept beating. Simpson fled with minimal cash in his pockets, leaving Pham lying in his own blood. Against the odds, Pham managed to call for help after the shooter disappeared. Paramedics arrived and rushed him to the hospital, where doctors fought to save a life that should have already been lost. Police investigators worked the case with determination. Witnesses provided descriptions. Evidence from the scene pointed towards suspects. The neighborhood's usual code of silence had cracks, and detectives exploited every opening. Within weeks, officers arrested Simpson. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Pham had survived and could identify the teenager who shot him. Other witnesses came forward to corroborate key details. Prosecutors built their case methodically. They charged Simpson as an adult despite his age of 16. Louisiana law permitted it for violent felonies, and this one qualified without question. The legal machinery ground forward. Simpson had no money for competent defense. The court-appointed attorney who represented him faced impossible odds from the start. The evidence was simply too strong. Tham's testimony carried devastating weight. The jury heard about the brutal beating that preceded the shooting. They learned about the execution-style shot to the head. When they retired to deliberate, it didn't take long. The verdict came back guilty. The judge sentenced Simpson to 6 years in Louisiana's correctional system. At 16 years old, he entered the adult prison world. The troubled teenager officially became a convicted felon, and that label would follow him for whatever life remained ahead. Louisiana's prisons ranked among the harshest in America. Violence soaked through every facility like blood into concrete. Gangs controlled the internal power structure with ruthless efficiency. New arrivals faced immediate testing to determine where they'd fit in the brutal hierarchy. Simpson's survival skills from the Ninth Ward transferred to this new battleground. He learned the prison rules fast, because hesitation meant becoming a victim. Older inmates controlled access to everything that mattered inside those walls. Fights erupted over the smallest perceived disrespect. Simpson stayed alert and formed the right alliances. The hypervigilance that developed during his chaotic upbringing intensified behind bars. Every conversation carried potential danger. Every glance could be interpreted as a challenge. Survival required constant attention to threats that could materialize from any direction. Time moved differently in prison. Days stretched into weeks, weeks into months, months into years. Simpson turned 17 behind bars, then 18, then older still. His 2 young sons grew and changed without him. Their formative years unfolded while he was locked away from the world. His mother's addiction meant visits were rare and irregular. Communication with his family dwindled to almost nothing. The prison offered education programs in theory. In practice, Simpson learned very little from them. Survival demanded more attention than personal growth. Each day meant navigating threats and maintaining his position in the violent social structure. Rehabilitation wasn't anyone's priority, least of all his own. Other inmates became his community by default. Many came from similar backgrounds of poverty and violence. They shared stories about the streets that shaped them, finding common ground in shared trauma. Gang affiliations from outside the walls continued inside, creating additional layers of tension and alliance. Simpson learned which groups offered protection and which ones meant danger. Choosing wrong could be fatal. He kept his head down as much as possible and avoided major infractions. Small conflicts flared occasionally, but nothing that extended his sentence beyond the original 6 years. Simpson focused on his release date while the world outside continued without him. Release day finally arrived in 2003. Simpson walked out of the facility wearing the same clothes he'd worn inside. At 22, Simpson tried to construct something resembling a functional life from the wreckage of his past. The Ninth Ward in 2003 looked exactly as he'd left it 6 years earlier. The neighborhood welcomed him back into its violent embrace without ceremony or celebration. Old associates who hadn't been killed or incarcerated were still there, still engaged in the same activities that led nowhere except prison or death. His sons barely recognized the young man who claimed to be their father. 6 years represented most of their conscious memory, and Simpson had been absent for all of it. He wanted to be present in their lives but possessed no blueprint for how to accomplish that. He had no job because no legitimate employer would hire someone with his record. No legal path existed for someone like him. He needed money to survive, and the streets offered the only option that made sense given his limited choices. The Ninth Ward's violence hadn't diminished during his incarceration. If anything, it had intensified. Arguments escalated into shootings with depressing regularity. Disputes over drug territory sparked gunfire that left bodies cooling on the pavement. Gang tensions exploded without warning or apparent reason. Simpson navigated this landscape with the wariness that prison had reinforced, his eyes constantly scanning for threats that could materialize from any direction. In November 2004, Violence finally found him in the most direct way possible. Someone opened fire in a drive-by shooting while Simpson was on the street. The shooter was never identified. The motive remained unknown and unknowable. 5 bullets struck Simpson before the car sped away into the Louisiana night. He collapsed onto the pavement as blood poured from multiple wounds that should have killed him. The damage was catastrophic. 1 bullet entered his skull, carrying fragments of bone into his brain tissue. Another tore through his abdomen, shredding organs. A third ripped through his left flank. The 4th punctured his left chest, threatening his lung. The 5th shattered his pelvis into pieces. Any single wound could have proven fatal. Together, they should have ended his life on that street. Witnesses called emergency services. Paramedics arrived and assessed injuries that seemed incompatible with survival. They worked frantically to stabilize him for transport. The ambulance raced toward the hospital with lights blazing and sirens screaming. Simpson remained conscious through the pain and shock, his mind struggling to process what had happened to his body. Emergency room doctors fought for hours to keep him alive. The skull wound required immediate neurosurgery. The abdominal injuries demanded urgent intervention to stop internal bleeding. The chest wound threatened his ability to breathe. The pelvis fracture added layers of surgical complexity. Medical teams worked through the night while Simpson's life hung in the balance. He survived, though barely. The months that followed were spent in hospital rooms, recovering from injuries that would leave permanent marks on both body and mind. The head trauma left lasting neurological effects that would never fully resolve. He survived, though barely. The months that followed were spent in hospital rooms, recovering from injuries that would leave permanent marks on both body and mind. The head trauma left lasting neurological effects that would never fully resolve. The abdominal damage was so severe that his intestines could no longer function properly. Surgeons had to create an opening in his abdomen where waste would empty into an external bag attached to his body. He'd wear this colostomy bag for the rest of his life, a constant physical reminder of the night he nearly died. The chest wound made breathing painful for weeks. Learning to walk again consumed months of grueling physical therapy. The psychological damage ran deeper than the physical wounds. Simpson had witnessed violence throughout his entire life. He'd committed violence himself. Now he'd nearly died from it in the most personal way imaginable. Something fundamental shifted inside him during those months of recovery. Severe paranoia took root in his traumatized mind. Any sudden movement triggered panic responses. Loud noises sent him into fight-or-flight mode. His nervous system remained permanently on high alert. Recovery stretched through early 2005. Summer arrived in 2005. Simpson had survived death, but emerged diminished in ways that extended far beyond the physical. His body was slowly healing. His mind was quietly breaking. He existed in a constant state of high alert that exhausted him even as it felt necessary for survival. Every stranger represented a potential full threat. Every passing car might carry a shooter. The trauma controlled how he perceived reality itself. Then August brought something that made street violence seem almost manageable by comparison. Weather forecasters began tracking a massive hurricane building terrifying strength in the Gulf of Mexico. Katrina grew to catastrophic proportions as it churned toward the Louisiana coast. New Orleans sat directly in its path. Evacuation orders went out across the city. Those with resources packed their cars and fled north. Simpson and his mother had no transportation, no money, no way out. They could only wait for the storm to arrive. Hurricane Katrina crashed into the Gulf Coast on August 29, 2005, with winds that tore buildings apart and storm surge that overwhelmed every defense New Orleans had constructed against the water. The levee system that protected the city failed catastrophically. Water poured into neighborhoods that sat below sea level, and the lower Ninth Ward flooded faster than anyone anticipated. Simpson and his mother watched through their apartment windows as the water climbed relentlessly toward them. The evacuation order had come too late for those without vehicles or money. Simpson owned no car. His mother had nothing. Public transportation had shut down before the storm arrived. They stayed in their apartment as Katrina's winds screamed through the city with apocalyptic fury. Power failed early, plunging everything into darkness, broken only by flashlight beams that seemed pathetically inadequate against the storm's rage. Water hit the ground floor first, then began climbing the stairs with inexorable determination. Residents fled upward as the flooding continued, driven higher by water that showed no signs of stopping. Simpson and his mother made it to the roof with others from their building. From that exposed perch, they watched the Ninth Ward disappear beneath brown water that swallowed everything familiar. The flood consumed cars, street signs, and first-floor windows. Their world was drowning. Destruction stretched to every horizon. Entire neighborhoods vanished beneath the surge. Rooftops became desperate islands where people waved frantically for help that was slow to arrive. Bodies floated past in the current, anonymous victims of a disaster whose full scope was still emerging. Simpson had witnessed terrible things in his life, but nothing compared to watching an entire city drown. New Orleans was dying beneath them. Rescue operations began with agonizing slowness. Coast Guard helicopters and volunteer boats navigated streets transformed into rivers. They pulled people from roofs and upper windows, working against time and the elements. A hoverboat reached Simpson's building on the second day. The operators helped residents climb aboard, their movements urgent but careful. Simpson got his mother into the craft, both of them soaked and exhausted. The hoverboat ferried them to a highway overpass, where authorities had established an evacuation point. Hundreds of people crowded onto the elevated roadway, all of them displaced, all of them uncertain about what came next. There was no food, no water, no medical care for those who were injured or sick. People simply waited for transportation that would carry them away from the drowned city. Simpson stood on that overpass looking at devastation that exceeded his capacity to fully process. The Ninth Ward he'd known his entire life had ceased to exist. Everything familiar lay submerged beneath filthy water. His entire world had drowned in a matter of hours. Whatever small measure of stability his life had held was gone completely. Buses finally arrived to transport the displaced. Simpson and his mother boarded separate vehicles heading toward emergency shelters in different directions. The bus deposited evacuees at the convention center, where thousands of displaced people packed into a facility never designed to hold them. Conditions deteriorated rapidly. Insufficient supplies meant hunger and thirst became constant companions. Inadequate bathrooms created sanitation nightmares. Tensions climbed in the crowded, desperate space where fear and uncertainty fed on themselves. Simpson saw things in that convention center that added new layers to his psychological damage. Bodies of dead evacuees lay stacked in back areas because heat and lack of refrigeration meant they couldn't be properly preserved. The smell permeated everything. People stepped around corpses to reach the bathrooms. The scene felt like something from a war zone, not an American city in the 21st century. Days blurred into each other in the chaos. Simpson searched desperately for his mother, but couldn't find her in the massive crowd. He had no way to contact his sons, no way to know if they'd survived. He owned nothing except the clothes on his body. His colostomy bag needed supplies he couldn't obtain. Medical needs went unaddressed in the overwhelmed facility. He existed in a fog of trauma and displacement. Eventually, authorities organized transportation out of New Orleans for those with somewhere to go. Buses carried evacuees to cities across the American South. Simpson learned through desperate inquiry that his mother had somehow made it to Norman, Oklahoma. He managed to get on a bus heading in that direction. The vehicle carried him away from Louisiana and everything he'd ever known, toward an uncertain future in a place he'd never seen. The bus finally reached Oklahoma City in September 2005. Simpson stepped off into a place that felt completely alien. He connected with his mother, who'd somehow found her way to Norman. She located a place for him to stay in Oklahoma City. The new environment felt hostile in its unfamiliarity. He knew absolutely no one. He had no resources, no support system, no understanding of how to navigate this strange new world. The displacement added another layer to his growing paranoia. Oklahoma City bore no resemblance whatsoever to New Orleans. The streets looked different. The people looked different. The culture felt completely foreign. Simpson felt isolated and vulnerable in ways that intensified the hypervigilance that already consumed him. He trusted no one in this unfamiliar environment, where he had no history, no connections, no way to distinguish friend from threat. He eventually met other Katrina evacuees trying to rebuild shattered lives in Oklahoma City. Two men named Jonathan Dalton and Latongo Robertson had also fled New Orleans after the storm destroyed everything they knew. The shared trauma created a bond between them. They understood what it meant to lose everything to floodwaters, to be displaced from the only home they'd ever known. Simpson's days became an exhausting struggle against anxiety and paranoia that never relented. The PTSD symptoms from the 2004 shooting had never been addressed by any mental health professional. Katrina's trauma layered on top of those untreated wounds. Flashbacks to being shot, reliving moments from the hurricane, nightmares that made sleep almost impossible. Loud noises triggered panic responses that left him shaking. He existed in a state of constant fear that he couldn't articulate or escape. While Simpson struggled to survive in his new reality, other young men in Oklahoma City were living lives that felt stable by comparison. They had grown up in this place. They knew its streets and rhythms. They had families, friends, and routines that provided structure. For them, Oklahoma City was home. They had no way of knowing that a traumatized stranger from New Orleans had arrived in their city, carrying wounds that would soon intersect with their lives in the most devastating way possible. Amongst these men was Glenn Palmer. Glenn Palmer was born in 1985 in Oklahoma City, growing up in a world completely different from the one that shaped Kendrick Simpson. His sister Crystal shared a close bond with him throughout their lives. The Palmer family maintained strong connections despite the normal challenges any household faces. Their struggles were ordinary, manageable, nothing like the chaos that defined life in New Orleans' lower Ninth Ward. Palmer attended local schools in the Oklahoma City area, where he developed friendships that would carry through his teenage years and into young adulthood. Sports interested him during his time in school. He participated in activities that kept him connected to his peers and gave him a sense of belonging. The social circles he built would remain important through his young adult life, providing the kind of stability that someone like Simpson had never known. During his teenage years, Palmer met two other young men who would become central to his life. They were Anthony Jones and London Johnson. Anthony Jones was born in 1986, a year after Palmer. London Johnson came into the world the same year as Jones. The three grew up in the same Oklahoma City neighborhoods, attending the same schools, navigating the same streets. Their friendship formed gradually during those formative years, strengthening as they moved from adolescence into young adulthood. What started as casual acquaintance deepened into something that resembled brotherhood more than ordinary friendship. Palmer, Jones, and Johnson became inseparable. They made plans together constantly. Weekend activities almost always included all three of them. They trusted each other completely in a world where trust was hard to come by. Jones maintained a close relationship with his sister Taliasha, and Johnson stayed connected to his parents. But the trio's friendship became the central organizing force in their daily lives. After completing their education, all three worked various jobs around Oklahoma City to support themselves as they established independence. The work varied and wasn't particularly glamorous, but it provided the income they needed. Palmer showed up and did what was required. Jones and Johnson approached their employment with similar seriousness, even when the jobs felt temporary or unfulfilling. Money meant independence and the ability to participate in the social activities that mattered to them. Palmer stood out physically among his friends. At 6 feet tall with substantial weight and muscle mass, he commanded respect through presence alone. Friends knew him as someone who could handle himself in difficult situations. People didn't typically challenge him directly. Jones stood about average height and build, carrying himself with quiet confidence. Johnson complemented them both with his own strengths and personality. Together, the three balanced each other well. They functioned as a unit rather than as individuals, and their social circle recognized them as inseparable. All three were connected to the street culture that existed in Oklahoma City. The Shotgun Crips gang operated in their area, and Palmer, Jones, and Johnson claimed association with the group. They wore blue clothing as a signal of their affiliation, understanding that in their world, colors served as identifiers and warnings. Blue belonged to the Crips. Red belonged to the Bloods, their rivals. The rivalry between these two gangs extended back decades and across the country, and Oklahoma City reflected this national pattern. Despite these street connections, all three maintained other aspects of their lives. Palmer stayed close to his sister Crystal and kept in contact with his mother and extended family. Jones valued his relationship with his sister Asha. Johnson balanced his street identity with family obligations. They worked legitimate jobs, they laughed with friends, they made plans for futures they believed would be better than their present circumstances. The gang affiliation represented one part of their identities, not the entirety of who they were. Palmer enjoyed his independence as a young adult. He had his own vehicle, a Chevrolet Caprice, which gave him mobility around Oklahoma City. He drove it regularly to work, social events, and visits with friends. Jones and Johnson often rode with him to various destinations. The car became an extension of their friendship, a space where they talked about life, relationships, and future plans. The conversations reflected typical concerns of young men in their position. They wanted success, but faced limited opportunities. Still, they approached life with the optimism of youth, believing better things would come eventually. As January 2006 began, their lives followed comfortable, predictable patterns. Work filled their weekdays, friends occupied their weekends. The gang culture provided structure and identity. The clubs offered entertainment and escape. Their families remained connected to them. Life moved forward in rhythms that felt safe in their familiarity. When the weekend of January 15th approached, Palmer, Jones, and Johnson made plans to go out Saturday night, as they had countless times before. Fritzy's seemed like the obvious choice. The club always had good music on Saturday nights. They looked forward to a normal evening of dancing and socializing, the same routine that had repeated itself many times without incident. They had no way of knowing that across Oklahoma City, another young man was making very different plans for that same night. A young man whose mind had been shattered by trauma. A young man who saw threats in every shadow and carried an assault rifle to feel safe. January 15th, 2006 started as an ordinary day for Kendrick Simpson. He spent the hours at his residence in Oklahoma City, the paranoia and hypervigilance that never left him humming quietly beneath the surface of every moment. As evening approached, Jonathan Dalton and Latongo Robertson came by. These were the two fellow evacuees Simpson had met after arriving in Oklahoma City. Dalton drove a white Monte Carlo that gave them mobility around a city none of them really knew. Simpson owned no car himself. He depended on friends for transportation. Just another way his life in Oklahoma City felt precarious and uncertain. The three men discussed plans for the night ahead, looking for distraction from the weight of displacement. Someone suggested going to a house party first. They knew about a gathering happening in the area where other evacuees and locals mixed. The party offered a place to drink and socialize, to forget for a few hours about flooded cities and ruined lives. Simpson agreed to the plan. Before leaving, he went inside his residence and retrieved an assault rifle. The weapon was an AK-style rifle, the kind of firepower that made him feel protected in a world where he trusted almost no one. He brought it with him because that's what made sense to a mind warped by untreated PTSD. The three drove in Dalton's Monte Carlo to Simpson's place so he could change clothes. Simpson went inside and came back out carrying the rifle. They placed it in the trunk of the car. The trunk could be accessed through the back seat, keeping the weapon close and available if Simpson's paranoia told him he needed it. In his fractured perception of reality, bringing an assault rifle to a party seemed like reasonable preparation rather than a dangerous escalation. They drove to the house party as darkness settled over Oklahoma City. The gathering had already started when they arrived. People drank alcohol and smoked marijuana, the music loud enough to feel in your chest. Conversations filled the rooms with laughter and energy. Simpson, Dalton, and Robertson joined in, accepting drinks and passing joints. Simpson drank beer and liquor, the alcohol mixing with his already unstable mental state. They smoked marijuana with others at the party, adding another layer of impairment to minds that would soon be making life-and-death decisions. Simpson also took ecstasy during the party. Dalton took some as well. The drug heightened their mood and energy. The combination of alcohol, marijuana, and ecstasy affected their judgment and perception. Hours passed at the party as they consumed more substances. Someone suggested moving to a club. Fritzy's hip-hop club opened late on Saturday nights. The venue attracted crowds looking to dance and socialize. The three men decided to go. They returned to Dalton's Monte Carlo. The rifle remained in the trunk accessible from the back seat. They drove toward northwest Oklahoma City, where Fritzy's was located. The club sat in an area familiar to the local crowd. It catered to the hip-hop scene. Young people gathered there regularly on weekends. The venue was known for its music and atmosphere. Simpson wore a red Chicago Cubs baseball cap. The color held no special meaning to him. He had no connection to Chicago or the Cubs. The cap was simply something he owned and wore. Red was just a color as far as he was concerned. The Monte Carlo arrived at Fritzy's between midnight and 1 in the morning. The parking lot held numerous vehicles. Music thumped from inside the building. People moved between the parking lot and the entrance. The club was busy with the typical Saturday night crowd. Simpson, Dalton, and Robertson entered the club. The interior held a bar area and a dance floor. Tables and seating occupied sections around the edges. Music played loudly from speakers. Colored lights swept across the space. People danced and talked in groups. The three men went to the bar first. They ordered drinks. The alcohol continued flowing into their already intoxicated systems. Simpson and Dalton were high on ecstasy. The marijuana and alcohol layered with the other drugs. Their perception of events was distorted by the substances. Dalton and Robertson found a table and sat down. Simpson stayed on his feet. He walked around the club. The ecstasy made him restless and energetic. He moved through the crowd, observing people in the space. The red Cubs cap sat on his head. Glenn Palmer, Anthony Jones, and London Johnson sat at a table in another part of the club. The three friends had arrived earlier. They were enjoying their usual Saturday night out together. Palmer wore blue clothing consistent with his Crips affiliation. Johnson also wore blue. The color signaled their gang identity. Simpson walked past their table during his wandering. Someone from the group said something about his red cap. The comment referred to the color. In gang culture, red represented the Bloods, blue represented the Crips. Someone wearing red in a space frequented by Crips members was noticed. Simpson didn't understand the significance initially. He had no gang affiliation in Oklahoma City. The red cap meant nothing to him beyond fashion. But Dalton heard about the comment. Dalton explained to Simpson that the red color probably offended local gang members. The Cubs cap had marked Simpson as someone wearing blood colors in Crips territory. Simpson returned to Palmer, Jones, and Johnson's table. The ecstasy made him confrontational. He told them he would chop them up. The word chop referred to an assault rifle. A chopper meant an AK-47 type weapon. Johnson understood Simpson was threatening to shoot them. Simpson walked away after making the threat. The situation could have ended there, but Simpson returned a short time later. This time he extended his hand toward Glenn Palmer. He said, "We cool." The gesture appeared to be an attempt at making peace. Simpson wanted to de-escalate the confrontation he had created. Palmer responded by punching Simpson in the mouth. The blow knocked Simpson to the floor. Palmer's size and strength made the punch devastating. Simpson fell hard. Club security noticed the incident. They moved to intervene. The situation was breaking down rapidly. Simpson got up from the floor. He returned to Dalton and Robertson. He told them he wanted to leave. The three men exited the club. They walked through the parking lot toward the white Monte Carlo. Simpson's face hurt from Palmer's punch. Anger and humiliation burned inside him alongside the drugs and alcohol. Simpson, Dalton, and Robertson reached the Monte Carlo in Fritzy's parking lot. They stood by the vehicle discussing what had happened inside. Simpson touched his face, where Palmer had punched him. The blow had knocked him down in front of everyone. The humiliation stung worse than the physical pain. Some women from inside the club came out to the parking lot. They had parked near Dalton's Monte Carlo. The women knew Simpson, Dalton, or Robertson from previous encounters. They stopped to talk. The conversation provided a temporary distraction from the confrontation. Palmer, Jones, and Johnson left Fritzy's after the security intervention. They walked to Palmer's Chevrolet Caprice. The three friends got in with Palmer driving and Jones in the front passenger seat. Johnson sat in the back. They pulled out of Fritzy's parking lot. Simpson saw Palmer's Caprice leaving. He recognized the vehicle and the people inside. The sight of them triggered his anger again. The ecstasy and alcohol distorted his thinking. The PTSD from his 2004 shooting made him paranoid about threats. The Hurricane Katrina trauma compounded his psychological state. His judgment was completely compromised. The women suggested going to a 7-Eleven nearby. They wanted to meet up there. Simpson, Dalton, and Robertson agreed. They got into the Monte Carlo. Dalton drove out of Fritzy's parking lot, heading toward the convenience store. Simpson rode in the front passenger seat. Robertson sat in the back. Palmer also drove to the same 7-Eleven. He needed to buy cigars. The convenience store sat a short distance from Fritzy's. Palmer pulled the Caprice into the parking lot. Jones and Johnson stayed in the car while Palmer went inside the store. They waited while he made his purchase. Dalton pulled the Monte Carlo into the 7-Eleven parking lot moments later. Simpson spotted Palmer's Caprice. The three men from the club were right there. Simpson's paranoid thinking interpreted this as a threat. He believed they had followed him. The PTSD made him certain they intended to harm him. He couldn't recognize the coincidence of both groups stopping at the same store. Palmer came out of the 7-Eleven with his cigars. He got back in the Caprice. He pulled out of the parking lot onto the street. Palmer intended to drive home. The night out had ended badly with the club confrontation. Palmer, Jones, and Johnson wanted to leave the area. Simpson told Dalton to follow Palmer's car. The paranoia convinced Simpson that he needed to act first. He believed Palmer and his friends were a threat. In his distorted mental state, Simpson thought they would come after him if he didn't strike first. Dalton hesitated but followed the instruction. The Monte Carlo pulled out behind the Caprice. Robertson sat in the back seat behind Simpson. The trunk access from the back seat meant Robertson could reach the rifle. Simpson told Robertson to get the gun. Robertson resisted. He didn't want to hand over the weapon. Simpson threatened Robertson. The threat made clear that refusal would have consequences. Robertson gave Simpson the assault rifle. The two cars traveled through northwest Oklahoma City streets. Palmer drove normally, unaware that the Monte Carlo behind him carried armed men. Jones and Johnson talked in the car. They discussed the confrontation at the club. The incident seemed over from their perspective. They just wanted to get home. Dalton followed Palmer's Caprice for over 3 miles. The chase covered significant distance through the streets. Simpson held the rifle in the front passenger seat. His mind raced with paranoid thoughts. The PTSD had convinced him these men posed an imminent threat. He had to act to protect himself. The drugs and alcohol destroyed any remaining judgment. The untreated trauma from being shot in 2004 made him hyper-vigilant about danger. The Hurricane Katrina experience had added another layer of psychological damage. Simpson's perception of reality was fundamentally distorted. He couldn't recognize that Palmer simply wanted to go home. Dalton pulled the Monte Carlo alongside Palmer's Caprice on the street. The two vehicles drove parallel for a moment. Simpson pointed the rifle out the passenger window. Palmer, Jones, and Johnson saw the gun in that instant. Recognition flashed across their faces. Simpson opened fire. The assault rifle discharged rounds rapidly. 20 to 25 bullets sprayed into the Caprice. The noise was deafening. Muzzle flash lit up the dark street. Shell casings ejected from the weapon. Simpson held the trigger down until the magazine emptied. Bullets tore through the Caprice's doors and windows. Glass shattered, metal punctured. The projectiles found human targets. Palmer took multiple hits in the driver's seat. Jones was struck repeatedly in the front passenger seat. Johnson ducked down in the back seat as bullets flew overhead. Palmer's body slumped over the wheel. The Caprice veered off the road. The car crashed into an electrical pole. The vehicle stopped suddenly. The engine died. Silence fell after the rifle's roar ended. Smoke drifted from the Monte Carlo's window where the barrel had been. Simpson shouted, "I'm a monster. I just shot the car up." The words came out in a rush of adrenaline and drugs. He added, "They shouldn't play with me like that." The statement revealed his distorted thinking. In his mind, he had acted in self-defense against a threat. The paranoia had convinced him they would have attacked him otherwise. Dalton accelerated away from the scene. The Monte Carlo sped through Oklahoma City's streets. They needed to get away from what had just happened. Dalton drove to a residence in Midwest City where he was staying. They went inside to hide the rifle. The weapon had just killed 2 men. London Johnson remained alive in the back seat of Palmer's wrecked Caprice. Bullets had flown past him during the shooting. He had ducked down as low as possible. The position saved his life. He emerged from the crouch when the gunfire stopped. Johnson looked around the car's interior. Glenn Palmer slumped motionless in the driver's seat. Multiple gunshot wounds covered his body. Blood soaked through his clothing. He wasn't breathing. Palmer was dead. Anthony Jones lay against the front passenger door. Bullets had struck him repeatedly. Blood poured from multiple wounds. Johnson could see Jones wasn't breathing either. His closest friend had died instantly during the shooting. Jones was gone. Johnson sat in the back seat surrounded by his dead friends. Glass covered everything. Bullet holes perforated the doors and seats. The smell of gunpowder filled the air. Blood splattered across the interior. The scene was horrific. Johnson managed to get out of the wrecked car. He stood on the street trying to process what had happened. His 2 best friends lay dead. The men from the club had followed them. They had opened fire without warning. Johnson had watched Palmer and Jones die. Nearby residents heard the gunshots and the crash. They came out to investigate. Someone saw Johnson standing by the car in shock. They saw the bodies inside the Caprice. People began calling 911. Emergency services received multiple reports of a shooting. Police officers arrived within minutes. They found Palmer's Caprice crashed into the electrical pole. They saw Palmer and Jones dead in the front seats. They found Johnson alive but traumatized. The officers secured the scene and called for detectives. Paramedics examined Johnson. He had survived physically unharmed. The psychological damage was immense. He had just watched his 2 closest friends murdered. The images of their bodies would replay in his mind for years. A part of him died in that car with them. Detectives from the Oklahoma City Police Department took control of the investigation. They photographed the scene extensively. The Caprice showed massive damage from bullets. Shell casings littered the street. The electrical pole bore marks from the crash. Blood evidence filled the car's interior. Officers counted approximately 20 entry wounds in the vehicle. The shooting had been sustained and deliberate. This wasn't random gang violence. Someone had followed Palmer's car and executed the occupants. The premeditation was obvious. Detectives interviewed Johnson at the scene. He described the confrontation at Fritzy's club. He explained about the red baseball cap and the threat Simpson had made. He described Palmer punching Simpson. Johnson gave details about leaving the club and stopping at the 7-Eleven. He told detectives about being followed for miles. He described the Monte Carlo pulling alongside them. He remembered the rifle coming out the window. The interview provided crucial information about the suspects. Johnson told investigators the shooter had yelled about being a monster and shooting up the car. The statement revealed the shooter's mindset. Johnson described Simpson, Dalton, and Robertson from the club. He gave descriptions of their appearances and clothing. The white Monte Carlo was a key detail. Detectives collected physical evidence from the scene. They recovered bullet fragments from the Caprice and surrounding area. They documented the trajectory of the shots. The evidence showed the shooter fired from the right front passenger position. The rifle had been pointed out the window at close range. Officers photographed Palmer and Jones where they died. The medical examiner would need detailed documentation. The bodies showed multiple gunshot wounds each. The shooting had been brutal and excessive. More bullets hit the car than necessary to kill 2 men. The medical examiner arrived to examine the bodies. Palmer had died from multiple gunshot wounds to vital organs. Jones had been killed by similar injuries. Both deaths were ruled homicides. The examiner would conduct full autopsies to recover bullets and document injuries. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood for witnesses. Some residents had heard the gunfire. A few had seen the white Monte Carlo speeding away. The information corroborated Johnson's account. Investigators began searching for the vehicle and its occupants. Officers ran the descriptions through their databases. The white Monte Carlo narrowed the search. Detectives looked for vehicles matching that description, registered in the Oklahoma City area. They compiled a list of potential suspects based on Johnson's descriptions. News of the double homicide spread quickly. Palmer and Jones's families received devastating phone calls. Crystal Palmer learned her brother was dead. Asha Jones heard that Anthony had been murdered. The families rushed to the scene or to the hospital, seeking information. The medical examiner transported Palmer and Jones's bodies to the morgue. Full autopsies would be performed. The bullets recovered would help identify the weapon used. The examiner would document every wound to build the prosecution's case. Detectives worked through the night gathering evidence. They interviewed everyone who had been at Fritzy's club. They talked to witnesses from the 7-Eleven. They followed every lead about the white Monte Carlo. The investigation moved rapidly because the shooting had multiple witnesses. Oklahoma City police identified the Monte Carlo within days. The vehicle belonged to Jonathan Dalton. Detectives learned Dalton was a Hurricane Katrina evacuee living in the area. They discovered he associated with other evacuees from New Orleans. The net was closing. Investigators located Dalton and brought him in for questioning. Dalton initially resisted talking. Detectives pressed him about the shooting. They had evidence placing his car at the scene. Dalton eventually broke down. He admitted being present during the shooting. He described Simpson as the shooter. He implicated Robertson as the third person in the car. Police arrested Simpson at his Oklahoma City residence. Officers found him there and took him into custody. They read him his Miranda rights. Simpson made statements acknowledging he was at Fritzy's and had been hit in the face. He didn't immediately confess to the shooting. Officers arrested Robertson as well. The three men from the Monte Carlo were now in custody. The investigation had moved from crime scene to arrests in just days. The evidence against them was overwhelming. Detective John George led the Oklahoma City police investigation into the double homicide. He interviewed Kendrick Simpson at the police station after his arrest. Simpson acknowledged being at Fritzy's club on January 16, 2006. He admitted to the confrontation with Palmer. Simpson confirmed that Palmer had punched him in the face. Simpson denied shooting anyone. He claimed ignorance about what happened after leaving the club. Detective George pressed him on the details. Simpson's story contained gaps and inconsistencies. The detective documented everything for the investigation file. Jonathan Dalton provided more detailed information during his interrogation. He described the entire night from the house party through the shooting. Dalton admitted driving the Monte Carlo while Simpson fired the rifle. He explained about following Palmer's caprice for miles. Dalton said Simpson had threatened them if they didn't comply. Latongo Robertson confirmed Dalton's account during his separate interview. Robertson described giving Simpson the rifle from the back seat. He said Simpson had threatened him when he initially refused. Robertson explained his fear of Simpson in that moment. The investigation now had two witnesses describing Simpson as the shooter. Detective George obtained a warrant to search Dalton's Monte Carlo. The vehicle was still at the Midwest City residence where the men had gone after the shooting. Officers seized the car and transported it to a police facility. Evidence technicians processed it thoroughly. The Monte Carlo showed gunshot residue on the front passenger door and window area. The evidence confirmed that a firearm had been discharged from that position. Shell casings were not found in the vehicle. Simpson had fired the rifle so that brass ejected outside the car. The absence of casings was itself evidence of how the shooting occurred. Investigators recovered the assault rifle from the residence where the men had hidden it. The weapon was an SKS assault rifle. Ballistics experts test-fired the weapon and compared the bullets to those recovered from Palmer's Caprice and the victims' bodies. The comparison matched. This rifle had fired the bullets that killed Palmer and Jones. Detective George interviewed London Johnson multiple times. Johnson provided consistent details about the confrontation at Fritzie's. He explained the gang culture context regarding the red baseball cap. Johnson described Palmer's punch and Simpson's threatening words. He detailed the chase and the shooting. Johnson's testimony would be crucial at trial. He was the only surviving victim. He had been in Palmer's car during the entire incident. Johnson could describe Simpson's face when the rifle came out the window. His account would establish premeditation and intent. Investigators interviewed witnesses from Fritzie's club. Multiple people remembered the confrontation. They confirmed seeing a man in a red Cubs cap get punched by a larger man. Several recalled the threat about chopping people up. The witnesses corroborated Johnson's version of events. The 7-Eleven stop was verified through security footage and witness statements. The video showed Palmer going inside for cigars. It showed both vehicles in the parking lot at the same time. The timeline matched the accounts from Dalton, Robertson, and Johnson. Police traced the route of the chase through Oklahoma City streets. They identified the path Palmer's Caprice had taken, with the Monte Carlo following. The distance covered exceeded 3 miles. The extended pursuit demonstrated premeditation. This wasn't a spontaneous act of violence. Detective George built a timeline of the entire evening. The house party established that Simpson brought the rifle. The drug and alcohol use explained his impaired judgment. The ecstasy consumption showed his altered mental state. The club confrontation provided motive. The chase demonstrated intent. The shooting proved guilt. While Simpson remained in custody, investigators learned about his background. They discovered his 1997 Louisiana conviction for shooting Hung Pham. They found records of his 6-year prison sentence. The prior violent crime would become an aggravating factor if prosecutors sought the death penalty. Detectives contacted Louisiana authorities about Simpson's previous case. Hung Pham had survived being shot in the head during the robbery. Pham agreed to testify about that incident if needed. His testimony would show Simpson's pattern of extreme violence. Investigators also learned about Simpson's 2004 shooting. Records showed he had been shot 5 times in New Orleans. Medical records documented the skull, chest, abdomen, and pelvis wounds. Simpson had spent months hospitalized and recovering. This information would later become relevant to his mental state defense. The Hurricane Katrina displacement was documented through evacuee records. Simpson had come to Oklahoma in September 2005, just 4 months before the murders. His traumatic experience during the storm would later be raised by his defense attorneys. Police found a crucial additional witness. A man named Collins had been in jail with Simpson after the arrest. Collins approached investigators with information. Simpson had talked to Collins about the shooting. He had made admissions and even bragged about the crime. Collins agreed to testify about Simpson's jailhouse statements. He said Simpson showed no remorse for the killings. According to Collins, Simpson laughed about shooting Palmer and Jones. Simpson allegedly wanted to threaten potential witnesses to keep them from testifying. This evidence would devastate any sympathy Simpson might receive. Collins wrote multiple letters to police and prosecutors detailing Simpson's admissions. The letters contained specific information about the crime that only someone involved would know. The jailhouse statements would become powerful evidence of guilt and lack of remorse. District Attorney David Prater reviewed the evidence Detective George had compiled. The case against Simpson was overwhelming. 2 accomplice witnesses, the surviving victim, physical evidence, the murder weapon, jailhouse admissions, a prior violent felony. Prater decided to seek the death penalty. Jonathan Dalton and Latango Robertson faced charges initially. The prosecutors offered them plea deals in exchange for testimony. Both had been accessories to murder, but Simpson was the shooter. The prosecution wanted their cooperation to ensure Simpson's conviction. Dalton pleaded guilty to accessory after the fact. He received a 20-year sentence. Robertson also pleaded guilty to accessory after the fact and received 20 years. Both agreed to testify truthfully at Simpson's trial. Their sentences would be served in Oklahoma's prison system. The plea deals drew criticism later. Simpson received a death sentence, while Dalton and Robertson got 20 years. Both were released after serving only 6 years. The disparity troubled some observers, but prosecutors needed their testimony to guarantee Simpson's conviction on the most serious charges. The state of Oklahoma formally charged Kendrick Antonio Simpson with 2 counts of first-degree murder with malice aforethought for killing Glenn Palmer and Anthony Jones. Additional charges included discharging a firearm with intent to kill for the shots at Lyndon Johnson, possession of a firearm, after former conviction of a felony rounded out the charges. The state of Oklahoma brought Kendrick Simpson to trial in 2007 in Oklahoma County District Court. The proceedings were structured in 2 phases. First, a guilt phase to determine if Simpson committed the crimes, then a penalty phase to decide between death and life imprisonment if he was convicted. Simpson's court-appointed defense attorneys understood they faced overwhelming evidence, so their strategy focused less on proving innocence and more on explaining Simpson's mental state and traumatic background in hopes of avoiding a death sentence. Jury selection required finding 12 citizens willing to consider the death penalty, which meant excluding anyone morally opposed to capital punishment. The final jury of 7 men and 5 women would hold Simpson's life in their hands. When the trial opened in spring 2007, Assistant District Attorney Steve Deutsch laid out the prosecution's case with devastating clarity. A confrontation at a nightclub, a 3-mile chase through Oklahoma City streets, and an execution-style shooting that left 2 young men dead. Lyndon Johnson became the prosecution's most powerful witness. He walked the jury through the entire night, describing how he arrived at Fritzy's with his best friends Palmer and Jones, how someone at their table commented on Simpson's red Chicago Cubs baseball cap, and how Simpson interpreted this as a challenge in the gang culture, where red represented the rival Bloods and blue represented the Crips. Johnson testified that Simpson returned to their table threatening to chop them up, street slang for shooting them with a chopper or assault rifle. When Simpson came back a second time trying to make peace by extending his hand and saying, "We cool," Palmer responded by punching him in the mouth, knocking Simpson to the floor in front of the entire club. Johnson's testimony continued with brutal detail about what happened after they left Fritzy's. Palmer stopped at a 7-Eleven to buy cigars while Johnson and Jones waited in the car. Johnson noticed the white Monte Carlo entering the parking lot with Simpson and his friends inside. When Palmer came out and drove away, the Monte Carlo followed them for over 3 miles through unfamiliar streets. Johnson grew increasingly concerned as the pursuit continued, then terrified when the Monte Carlo pulled alongside them. He saw the rifle come out the window. He saw Simpson holding it. Johnson ducked down in the back seat as approximately 20 shots tore through the car, shattering glass everywhere. When the gunfire stopped and the car had crashed into a pole, Johnson looked up to see his 2 best friends dead in the front seats. Jonathan Dalton and Latongo Robertson testified under plea agreements that gave them 20 years for accessory charges in exchange for their cooperation. Dalton described picking up Simpson, going to his house where Simpson retrieved the assault rifle, attending a house party where they consumed alcohol, marijuana, and ecstasy, then heading to Fritzy's. He told the jury about the confrontation in the club and Simpson getting punched by Palmer. After they left and stopped at the 7-Eleven, Simpson saw Palmer's car and ordered Dalton to follow it. Dalton admitted following the Caprice for over 3 miles, while Simpson ordered Robertson to get the rifle from the trunk, threatening Robertson when he initially hesitated. Dalton testified that Simpson pointed the rifle out the window and opened fire, then yelled afterward, "I'm a monster. I just shot the car up. They shouldn't play with me like that." Robertson's testimony matched Dalton's account exactly, providing consistent and damaging evidence about Simpson's actions and state of mind. Detective John George described the investigation, Simpson's admissions about being at Fritzy's and getting punched, and the discovery of both the white Monte Carlo and the SKS assault rifle. Ballistics testing matched the rifle to bullets recovered from the victims' bodies and the crime scene. The prosecution also called Collins, Simpson's former jail cellmate, who testified that Simpson showed no remorse and had even laughed about the crime while in jail. Collins claimed Simpson said he wanted to kill potential witnesses to prevent their testimony, and read from letters he'd written to police detailing these alleged jailhouse admissions. The defense objected that this was hearsay, but the judge overruled the objection and allowed both the testimony and the letters. Physical evidence completed the prosecution's overwhelming case. Crime scene photographs showed Palmer's bullet-riddled caprice. Autopsy photos displayed the victim's wounds in graphic detail. The rifle itself was shown to the jury along with shell casings and bullet fragments. The medical examiner testified that both Palmer and Jones suffered multiple gunshot wounds to vital organs, with death coming rapidly for both men. The excessive number of shots demonstrated clear intent to kill. After 9 days of testimony, the prosecution rested, confident they had proven Simpson was a violent criminal who executed 2 men over a minor nightclub confrontation, with premeditation shown by the 3-mile chase and intent proven by the sustained gunfire. The defense faced the nearly impossible task of creating doubt or sympathy in the face of this evidence. Their primary witness was Dr. Philip Masad, a clinical psychologist who had evaluated Simpson before trial. Dr. Masad testified about Simpson being shot 5 times in New Orleans in 2004, spending months hospitalized and in a coma, suffering bullet wounds to his skull, abdomen, chest, and pelvis that left him requiring a colostomy bag permanently. The psychological impact was severe and completely untreated, with Simpson never receiving therapy or counseling for the trauma. Dr. Masad diagnosed Simpson with post-traumatic stress disorder stemming from the 2004 shooting, explaining that Simpson developed severe paranoia about threats to his safety, where loud noises triggered panic responses and sudden movements caused defensive reactions. His perception of danger had been fundamentally distorted by trauma. The psychologist also testified about Hurricane Katrina's impact, describing Simpson's evacuation in a hoverboat, witnessing someone jump to their death from an overpass, and sheltering at the convention center where bodies of dead evacuees were stacked. This additional trauma compounded Simpson's existing PTSD. The defense wanted Dr. Masad to testify that Simpson may have experienced a dissociative episode during the shooting, with his PTSD causing him to flash back to his own near-death experience in 2004, making his traumatized brain interpret Palmer's presence at the 7-Eleven as an imminent threat that triggered an extreme defensive response. However, the trial judge delivered a crushing blow to this strategy by ruling that PTSD evidence could not be presented during the guilt phase. Oklahoma law didn't recognize PTSD as a defense that negated intent except through the insanity defense. And Simpson clearly wasn't legally insane. The judge restricted Dr. Masad's testimony, saving it for the penalty phase if Simpson was convicted. This left the defense scrambling to present their case. They introduced evidence about Simpson's horrific upbringing in the violent Ninth Ward housing projects, his mother's crack cocaine addiction, his father's abandonment, and the sexual abuse he suffered from ages 11 to 16 without any intervention or therapy. They called witnesses about his time in Louisiana prison from ages 16 to 22 after being tried as an adult for shooting Hung Pham. The defense painted a picture of someone shaped by violence and trauma from early life through young adulthood, arguing that Simpson brought the rifle to Fritzy's for protection due to his paranoid mental state after being shot in 2004, not to commit murder. The defense emphasized Simpson's intoxication, arguing that alcohol, marijuana, and ecstasy, combined with untreated PTSD, created conditions where Simpson wasn't thinking clearly when he followed Palmer's car. They presented his distorted perception as making him genuinely believe Palmer intended to harm him. Defense witnesses testified about Simpson's positive qualities and his efforts to maintain relationships with his sons despite being incarcerated and shot. Letters from his sons were read to the jury to humanize Simpson and show his capacity for love and connection. But the defense couldn't contradict the prosecution's timeline of events. They didn't dispute that Simpson fired the rifle. They couldn't challenge the 3-mile chase or the sustained gunfire. The physical evidence was incontrovertible, and the accomplice testimony was consistent. Simpson's guilt seemed certain from the start. The defense's closing argument acknowledged the tragedy and the destroyed families, but asked the jury to consider that Simpson's PTSD made him perceive threats that weren't real and that the drugs and alcohol destroyed his judgment. They argued Simpson needed help, not execution. The prosecution's closing argument systematically demolished the defense narrative. Assistant District Attorney Deutsch pointed out that Simpson chose to bring a rifle to a nightclub, chose to threaten Palmer, Jones, and Johnson, chose to follow them for 3 miles after being punched, chose to order his friends to give him the rifle, and chose to fire 20 rounds into their car. These were conscious decisions, not the actions of someone having a PTSD flashback. The prosecution emphasized Simpson's own words immediately after the shooting. "I'm a monster. I just shot the car up. They shouldn't play with me like that." Those words demonstrated that Simpson knew exactly what he had done and felt satisfaction at getting revenge for being disrespected. This wasn't a traumatized victim experiencing a dissociative episode. This was a remorseless killer who executed 2 young men over a bruised ego. The jury began deliberations in May 2007, and the verdict seemed inevitable given the overwhelming evidence. Simpson had admitted being at the club. Multiple witnesses placed him in the Monte Carlo. The rifle matched the bullets recovered from the victims. Both accomplices testified he was the shooter. Johnson had identified him and watched him pull the trigger. When the jury returned, they delivered guilty verdicts on all counts. 2 counts of first-degree murder with malice aforethought for killing Glenn Palmer and Anthony Jones, discharging a firearm with intent to kill for shooting at London Johnson, and possession of a firearm after former conviction of a felony, reflecting his 1997 Louisiana conviction. Simpson wiped tears from his eyes as the verdicts were read, the reality of what lay ahead finally settling in. The guilt phase had ended, but the worst was yet to come. Now, the same jury would decide whether Kendrick Simpson would spend the rest of his life in prison or be executed by the state of Oklahoma. The penalty phase of Kendrick Simpson's trial began days after the guilty verdicts. The same jury would decide his punishment. Oklahoma law allowed only 2 options for double murder: death by lethal injection or life imprisonment without possibility of parole. The prosecution sought death. The state had to prove aggravating factors to justify a death sentence. 4 aggravators were presented to the jury. First, Simpson had a prior conviction for a violent crime. The 1997 Louisiana conviction for shooting Hung Pham qualified. Second, Simpson knowingly created a great risk of death to more than one person. Palmer, Jones, and Johnson were all in the car when he fired. Third, the murders were especially heinous, atrocious, or cruel. Fourth, Simpson posed a continuing threat to society. Hung Pham took the witness stand during the penalty phase. He was now in his 50s. Pham described the 1997 robbery at his electronics repair shop in New Orleans. Simpson had been 16 years old when he forced his way into the shop. Pham testified about being beaten across the face and back. Simpson forced him to his knees and shot him in the head. Pham showed the jury his scar where the bullet struck his ear. He explained the lasting effects of being shot in the head. The testimony demonstrated Simpson's capacity for extreme violence even as a teenager. The pattern of shooting people in confrontations was established. Simpson had done this before and would likely do it again. Detective George returned to testify about Simpson's jail statements to Collins. The prosecution emphasized Simpson's alleged comments about wanting to kill witnesses. Simpson reportedly showed no remorse and laughed about the murders. The continuing threat aggravator was supported by this evidence of Simpson's mindset. The prosecution called the trial judge to testify about Simpson's courtroom behavior. The judge described Simpson as showing no remorse during the trial. According to the judge, Simpson smirked in court. This testimony reinforced the narrative of Simpson as an unrepentant killer who enjoyed what he had done. The prosecution argued that Simpson deserved death because he was the worst of the worst. He had hunted Palmer and Jones for 3 miles before executing them. The shooting was sustained and deliberate. Simpson expressed satisfaction afterward. He had a prior violent felony. He threatened witnesses. Society needed protection from someone this dangerous. The defense presented mitigation evidence during the penalty phase. Dr. Massad's full testimony about PTSD was now allowed. The psychologist explained Simpson's distorted threat perception. The 2004 shooting had left him with severe paranoia. Hurricane Katrina added another layer of trauma. The combination created a mental state where Simpson genuinely believed Palmer intended to kill him. Dr. Massad testified that Simpson's PTSD was treatable but had gone undiagnosed and untreated. With proper medication and therapy, Simpson could manage the condition. The defense argued that execution wasn't necessary. Simpson could serve life in prison, where he posed no threat to society. The death penalty should be reserved for the worst offenders. Simpson's mental illness made him less culpable. The defense presented more evidence about Simpson's horrific upbringing. His mother was 16 and addicted to crack when he was born. His father abandoned him. Simpson witnessed constant violence in the Ninth Ward projects. Bodies, shootings, and stabbings were normal in his world. He received no guidance or stability. Witnesses testified about Simpson being sexually abused from ages 11 to 16. The trauma went unaddressed. No one protected him or got him help. Simpson fathered 2 sons at 16 while still being victimized himself. The defense painted a picture of a broken young man destroyed by circumstances. The defense emphasized Simpson's age at the time of the 2004 shooting and Hurricane Katrina. He was only 24 when these traumatic events occurred. His brain hadn't fully developed. The PTSD struck when he was still psychologically immature. Simpson never had a chance to process the trauma before the 2006 murders occurred. Defense attorneys argued that sentencing Simpson to death would accomplish nothing. It wouldn't bring Palmer or Jones back. It wouldn't heal their families. Execution would just create another death and more grieving relatives. Life without parole meant Simpson would die in prison eventually. Society would be protected without taking another life. The victims' families testified during the penalty phase. Crystal Palmer described losing her brother Glenn. She explained how the murder destroyed her family. Palmer had been protective and loving. His death left a void that could never be filled. Crystal supported the death penalty for Simpson. Telly Asha Jones testified about her brother Anthony's death. She described the pain of losing someone so close. Anthony had dreams and potential. Simpson took all of that away over nothing. Telly Asha wanted Simpson executed for what he did to her brother and their family. Lyndon Johnson testified about the lasting trauma. He described replaying the images of Palmer and Jones dying in the car. The psychological wounds would never heal. A part of Johnson died with his friends that night. He supported the death penalty as appropriate justice. The prosecution's closing argument emphasized Simpson's choices. He chose to bring a rifle to Fritzie's. He chose to threaten Palmer, Jones, and Johnson. After being punched, he chose revenge instead of walking away. He chose to follow them for 3 miles. He chose to fire 20 rounds into their car. He chose to brag about it afterward. These choices warranted death. The defense's closing argument pleaded for mercy. Simpson was sick with untreated PTSD. He grew up in unimaginable circumstances. He suffered trauma after trauma without help. The death penalty should be reserved for the worst cases. Simpson's mental illness made him less culpable. Life without parole was sufficient punishment. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. They returned with their sentencing verdict. The jury recommended death by lethal injection for both murder counts. The aggravating factors outweighed the mitigating circumstances. Simpson showed no emotion as the recommendation was read. The judge followed the jury's recommendation. Simpson was formally sentenced to death on 2 counts of first-degree murder. He received additional prison time for the other convictions. The sentences would be served on Oklahoma's death row at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAllister. Simpson was 27 years old when sentenced to death. He had lived a life marked by violence from childhood through young adulthood. The Ninth Ward, the shooting, Hurricane Katrina, and his own actions had led him to death row. He would spend the next 19 years there waiting for the execution chamber. Kendrick Simpson arrived at Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAllister in late 2007. Death row inmates lived in H Unit, a maximum security section. Simpson was placed in a cell measuring approximately 8 by 12 feet. He would spend 23 hours a day there. 1 hour allowed for recreation in a small indoor yard. The isolation was extreme. Simpson had no contact visits initially. Family members could only see him through glass. Phone calls were limited and monitored. Mail was heavily screened. The solitary confinement itself constituted punishment beyond the death sentence. Simpson's cell contained a bed, toilet, and sink. He received 3 meals daily through a slot in the door. Books from the prison library provided his only entertainment. Television access was limited. Simpson had nothing but time to reflect on what brought him there. His attorneys filed automatic appeals following the death sentence. Oklahoma law required appellate review of all capital cases. The Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals would examine the trial for errors. Simpson's lawyers raised multiple issues challenging his conviction and sentence. The defense argued that accomplice testimony from Dalton and Robertson was improperly admitted. They claimed the testimony wasn't adequately corroborated by independent evidence. The appeals court rejected this argument. London Johnson's testimony and the physical evidence provided sufficient corroboration. Simpson's attorneys challenged the admission of Collins's jailhouse statements. They argued the letters were inadmissible hearsay. The appeals court found no reversible error. Collins had testified in person and been cross-examined. The letters simply reinforced his testimony. The defense raised claims about inflammatory crime scene photographs. They argued the images were more prejudicial than probative. The appeals court disagreed. The photographs showed the nature and location of wounds. They corroborated the medical examiner's testimony. The trial judge hadn't abused discretion in admitting them. Simpson's lawyers argued ineffective assistance of counsel. They claimed trial attorneys failed to adequately investigate and present mitigation evidence. The appeals focused on the PTSD diagnosis and traumatic background. Better representation might have resulted in a life sentence instead of death. The Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals reviewed the entire trial record. They examined each claimed error carefully. In 2010, the court issued its decision. The conviction and death sentence were affirmed. Simpson had received a fair trial. The evidence supported the verdicts. The death sentence was appropriate, given the aggravating factors. Simpson's attorneys filed a petition for certiorari with the United States Supreme Court. They asked the High Court to review the state court's decision. The Supreme Court receives thousands of petitions annually and grants very few. In 2011, the court denied Simpson's petition without comment. The direct appeal was exhausted. The next phase involved state post-conviction proceedings. Simpson's attorneys filed a petition raising new claims not addressed on direct appeal. They argued trial counsel was ineffective for failing to adequately investigate Simpson's mental health and present mitigation evidence. The post-conviction petition detailed Simpson's childhood trauma more extensively. Attorneys presented evidence about his mother's addiction, his sexual abuse, and the violence he witnessed. They argued the jury never heard the full extent of Simpson's suffering. A better-informed jury might have chosen life over death. Simpson's post-conviction petition argued that PTSD evidence should have been presented during the guilt phase so the jury could understand how trauma affected his actions during the shooting. The state countered that Dr. Mossad had testified fully during the penalty phase, and the jury simply rejected the mitigation evidence. The Oklahoma County District Court and Court of Criminal Appeals both denied relief in 2015, finding trial counsel performed adequately. Simpson then filed federal habeas corpus, claiming the PTSD restriction violated his constitutional right to present a complete defense and alleging prosecutorial misconduct. The federal district court denied his petition in 2017, finding the state proceedings met constitutional standards under the strict deference required by federal law. The 10th Circuit affirmed this decision in 2019 after oral arguments. Simpson's final petition to the U.S. Supreme Court was denied in 2019 without comment. All standard appeals were exhausted and his death sentence was final. Only clemency could prevent execution. Oklahoma initially scheduled his execution for 2024, but protocol concerns caused delays, and the execution was reset for February 12, 2026. Simpson spent 19 years on Oklahoma's death row in near-total solitary confinement in H Unit, experiencing the severe psychological toll of extended isolation. In 2015, he was selected to move to A Unit, which offered dramatic improvements. A window with natural light, contact visits where he could hug his sons, group religious services, and outdoor recreation with other inmates. However, A Unit required double celling to accommodate more prisoners, and Simpson's severe PTSD made sharing a cell unbearable. He was forced to choose between better conditions or living alone, and reluctantly moved back to H Unit, losing everything, including the chance to ever hold his granddaughter Denver, who was born after his return. Despite the harsh conditions, Simpson focused on self-improvement. He became the first person on Oklahoma's death row to earn a GED, then enrolled in college correspondence courses where he earned honors. He discovered poetry as an outlet for processing his experiences and showed genuine talent, writing about remorse, redemption, and transformation. In 2024, his poem Who Am I won a competition at Rose State College. He compiled his poems, short stories, and essays into a published book. Tenna Jefferson from Voice Coalition visited Simpson regularly and witnessed his transformation, later testifying at his clemency hearing that he was horribly remorseful and sorry for his crimes. Simpson maintained relationships with his 4 sons through letters and calls, offering guidance and recorded video statements for his clemency hearing. Reverend Don Heath became his spiritual advisor and close friend, witnessing Simpson's spiritual growth and fundamental change from the scared young man who committed the murders. Simpson spent his final years on death row, aware his execution approached. Oklahoma scheduled his death for February 12, 2026. Simpson prepared himself mentally and spiritually. He continued writing and maintaining relationships. The countdown to death shaped his final months. The Oklahoma Pardon and Parole Board scheduled Kendrick Simpson's clemency hearing for January 14, 2026, less than a month before his execution date. The 5-member board would recommend whether Governor Kevin Stitt should commute Simpson's death sentence to life without parole, though only the governor could grant clemency, and he would only consider it if the board recommended mercy. Simpson's attorneys Emma Rolls and her team prepared extensively, compiling evidence about Simpson's traumatic background, PTSD diagnosis, and transformation on death row into a comprehensive clemency packet. The hearing took place at the Oklahoma Department of Corrections, with board members facing Simpson and his attorneys, while the victims' families attended to speak against clemency and media filled the room. Emma Rolls presented Simpson's case first, describing his nightmarish childhood with a 16-year-old crack-addicted mother and absent father, the sexual abuse from ages 11 to 16, the 2004 shooting where he was shot 5 times and developed severe untreated PTSD, and Hurricane Katrina's devastating impact. Rolls argued the jury never fully understood Simpson's mental illness because PTSD evidence was restricted during the guilt phase, meaning they didn't hear how trauma distorted his threat perception when Palmer appeared at the 7-Eleven after the club confrontation. The attorneys emphasized Simpson's remarkable transformation on death row, becoming the first Oklahoma death row inmate to earn a GED, taking college courses where he earned honors, and winning poetry recognition from Rose State College. Tenna Jefferson testified about witnessing Simpson's changes and his horrible remorse. Simpson's sons provided recorded video statements describing their father's positive influence despite incarceration. Archbishop Paul Coakley submitted a statement urging clemency, arguing that society had means to protect itself without taking another life. Simpson then addressed the board directly, standing and speaking about his shame and remorse for murdering Glenn Palmer and Anthony Jones. He apologized without making excuses, explaining he was young and traumatized at the time, but was ignorant about what was important in life. Simpson said he was ashamed of his actions and of being a murderer. He told the board he had dedicated himself to nonviolence while traveling the road to redemption and asked for their collective mercy, though he admitted he didn't deserve it. Simpson insisted he wasn't the worst of the worst or a monster, saying that whether he lived 4 more weeks or 40 more years, remorse would be part of his testimony. The victims' families spoke powerfully against clemency. Crystal Allison described losing her protective and loving brother, Glenn, how the murder destroyed their family, and how she had to tell their mother while she herself was incarcerated. Allison described the pain as never-ending and explained that a close family friend had taken her own life because of trauma from Palmer's murder, showing how the ripples of Simpson's crime extended far beyond the initial victims. She supported Simpson's execution and wanted him dead for what he did. Tellyasha Jones testified about how Simpson took all their lives when he killed her brother Anthony and how the family never recovered. London Johnson told the board that part of him died in Palmer's car and the suffering and images replayed constantly in his mind. Oklahoma Attorney General Gentner Drummond submitted a statement calling Simpson a ruthless and violent killer who hunted his victims without remorse. Arguing that nothing in his decades on death row showed he deserved mercy, he refused to give Palmer and Jones. Assistant Attorney General Christopher Howard disputed the defense's claims, emphasizing that if Simpson hadn't brought a gun that night, hadn't followed them, and hadn't murdered 2 people, they wouldn't be there at all. The prosecution emphasized the trial judge's testimony about Simpson showing no remorse and smirking in court. The jailhouse cellmate's claims that Simpson laughed about the murders, and the pattern of violence starting with shooting Hung Pham at 16. The board voted 3-2 against recommending clemency. The majority found the aggravating factors outweighed Simpson's traumatic background and rehabilitation, with the premeditated nature of the 3-mile chase and shooting convincing them Simpson deserved execution. Crystal Allison cried out, "Yes," when the vote was announced, with relief flooding the victims' families that justice was finally approaching after 20 years. Simpson showed no visible emotion, having hoped for mercy but received none. Oklahoma law prevented Governor Stitt from intervening without the board's recommendation, meaning the 3-2 vote sealed Simpson's fate with only a court stay able to prevent execution now. With Simpson's execution scheduled for February 12, 2026, his attorneys filed final appeals in state and federal courts as time ran out. They filed a federal lawsuit challenging Oklahoma's 3-drug lethal injection protocol as violating the 8th Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment, arguing that midazolam might not render inmates unconscious before subsequent drugs cause suffering. The lawsuit detailed problems with previous Oklahoma executions where inmates appeared to remain conscious and showed signs of distress. The federal district court denied the stay request, finding Oklahoma's protocol had been upheld in previous cases, and Simpson hadn't shown substantial likelihood of success. Simpson's attorneys appealed to the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals, asking for an emergency stay, but the 10th Circuit denied it on February 10, 2026, finding Oklahoma's execution protocol satisfied constitutional standards. On February 9th, Simpson's attorneys filed a final petition with Supreme Court Justice Neil Gorsuch, who oversees the 10th Circuit, asking for a stay to allow full Supreme Court review. The petition emphasized Simpson's PTSD and the failure to present this evidence adequately at trial. Justice Gorsuch referred the petition to the full Supreme Court, where 5 votes were needed to halt the execution. The Supreme Court denied Simpson's petition on February 11, 2026 without comment, with no justice publicly dissenting. The court's order meant no further appeals remained, and Simpson's execution would proceed the next morning. Simpson's attorneys notified him of the decision, and the final legal avenue had closed. Prison officials moved Simpson to a holding cell near the execution chamber, where he spent his final night under constant observation with guards checking on him every 15 minutes. Simpson was allowed a final phone call to his family, where he spoke with his sons and other relatives in emotional conversations that provided closure. He told them he loved them and asked them to remember him as more than the worst thing he had done. Reverend Don Heath stayed with Simpson through the night, praying together, reading scripture, and answering Simpson's questions about what would happen after death. Their friendship had grown deep over years of visits, and Heath provided crucial comfort in these final hours. Simpson's final meal was served on February 11th, consisting of a bacon cheeseburger, large onion rings, and a strawberry milkshake from a local restaurant within Oklahoma's reasonable limits for last meals. Simpson ate portions, but his appetite was limited. Prison officials confirmed all legal barriers had been cleared and the execution would proceed at 10 in the morning on February 12th, with media notified, witnesses confirmed, and both the victims' families and Simpson's supporters preparing to attend. Crystal Allison, Teleasha Jones, and London Johnson prepared to witness the execution they had waited 20 years to see. London Johnson decided to attend the execution. He wanted to see justice carried out for his murdered friends. The trauma from that night had never left him. Johnson hoped witnessing Simpson's death might provide some measure of peace. Simpson's supporters gathered outside the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAllister. Death penalty opponents held a vigil beginning at 9 a.m. They prayed for Simpson and for abolition of capital punishment. The vigil continued through the execution. The Oklahoma Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty organized protests. They argued Simpson's case highlighted problems with the death penalty system. His mental illness should have resulted in a life sentence. Executing someone with severe PTSD was wrong. The protests continued until the execution concluded. Simpson met with his attorneys for the final time on the morning of February 12th. They expressed their regret at not saving his life. Simpson thanked them for their efforts over nearly 2 decades. He held no grudges. The legal team had fought hard. Reverend Heath accompanied Simpson to the execution chamber. Oklahoma allows spiritual advisors to be present. Heath would witness the execution and provide comfort in Simpson's final moments. The Reverend steeled himself for what he would see. Prison officials prepared the execution chamber. The gurney was ready. The chemicals were prepared. Medical personnel stood by to monitor vital signs. Witnesses gathered in separate viewing rooms. The victim's family sat on one side. Simpson supporters sat on another. Media witnesses occupied a third area. Simpson was escorted from the holding cell to the execution chamber. Guards accompanied him. Simpson walked calmly. He showed no resistance. Prison officials helped him onto the gurney. They secured straps across his body. Simpson lay restrained, looking at the ceiling. Medical personnel inserted IV lines into Simpson's arms. The lines connected to tubes leading to the chemical delivery system. The drugs would flow through these tubes when the execution began. Simpson felt the needles enter his veins. The final preparations were complete. The warden asked Simpson if he had any final words. Simpson could address the witnesses. His statement would be his last communication with the living world. Simpson took a breath and began to speak. Kendrick Simpson lay strapped to the gurney in Oklahoma State Penitentiary's execution chamber. IV lines ran from both arms. Witnesses watched through glass windows. The warden stood nearby. Reverend Don Heath sat in the viewing area where Simpson could see him. The time was 10 a.m. on February 12, 2026. The warden asked Simpson if he had any final words. Simpson turned his head toward the viewing area where his supporters sat. He could see the faces of people who had advocated for his life. Simpson spoke clearly despite the circumstances. "I love y'all," Simpson said. He named several people who had attended. "Thank y'all for being here to support me." His voice remained steady. Simpson paused briefly, then added, "That's it." He had no words for the victims' families. He said nothing about Glenn Palmer or Anthony Jones. The brief statement concluded. Crystal Allison watched from the victim's family viewing area. She listened to Simpson's final words. The absence of any apology or acknowledgement to Palmer and Jones's families upset her. Simpson thanked his supporters but said nothing about the men he murdered. The omission felt like a final insult. The warden signaled for the execution to begin. At 10:07 a.m., the first drug started flowing through the IV lines. Midazolam, a sedative, entered Simpson's bloodstream. The drug was meant to render him unconscious before the subsequent chemicals. Simpson's eyes closed as the sedative took effect. Reverend Heath began reading from the Bible. His voice carried softly through the chamber. The scripture provided spiritual comfort in Simpson's final moments. Heath had promised to be there until the end. He kept that promise as Simpson lost consciousness. Simpson opened his eyes one final time. He looked toward his supporters in the viewing area. Simpson raised his thumb in a gesture to them. The thumbs up was his final communication with the living. Then his eyes closed again. The sedative pulled him under. At 10:12 a.m., witnesses heard Simpson snoring. The sound indicated he had reached a deep level of unconsciousness. A doctor entered the chamber to check Simpson's responsiveness. The doctor performed tests to confirm Simpson wasn't conscious. The doctor declared Simpson unresponsive and left the chamber. The second drug, vecuronium bromide, began flowing at that point. This chemical paralyzes the muscles, including those used for breathing. Simpson's breathing stopped as the drug took effect. His chest no longer rose and fell. The paralytic was doing its work. 2 tears fell from Simpson's left eye and rolled down his cheek. The drops passed over 2 teardrop tattoos on his upper cheek. The tears appeared involuntary rather than emotional. Bodies sometimes react in unexpected ways during execution. The witnesses noted the tears but couldn't know their meaning. The third drug, potassium chloride, flowed through the IV lines. This chemical stops the heart. It causes cardiac arrest. The execution protocol called for all 3 drugs to ensure death occurred. Medical personnel monitored Simpson's vital signs as the chemicals worked. Simpson lay still on the gurney. His body showed no movement. His breathing had stopped. His heart slowed and then ceased beating. The 3-drug cocktail had completed its purpose. Kendrick Antonio Simpson was dying. At 10:19 a.m., a doctor entered the chamber again. The doctor checked Simpson's vital signs. No heartbeat was detected. No breathing occurred. No pulse existed. The doctor officially pronounced Simpson dead. The execution had taken approximately 12 minutes from first drug to death pronouncement. The warden announced that the execution had been carried out according to the court order. The witnesses sat in silence, processing what they had observed. Some felt justice had been served. Others felt the state had committed murder. The divided reactions reflected the ongoing debate about capital punishment. Crystal Allison watched Simpson's death through the glass. She had waited 20 years for this moment. Her brother Glenn could finally rest in peace, but Allison felt unsettled by Simpson's demeanor. He had smiled even as he lay dying. The same smile that had tormented her for 2 decades was there until the end. Taliasha Jones witnessed her brother Anthony's killer die. Justice had been served, but the pain remained. Anthony was still gone. Nothing would bring him back. The execution provided a sense of finality, but not healing. Jones left the viewing area with mixed emotions. London Johnson attended the execution as the sole survivor of the shooting. He had watched Palmer and Jones die in 2006. Now he watched their killer die. Johnson prayed throughout the execution. He had bottled up emotions for 20 years. The execution allowed some release, but the trauma would never fully fade. Simpson supporters left the viewing area quietly. They had witnessed the state take a life. Some believed Simpson had changed during his years on death row. They saw his execution as wrong despite his crimes. The death penalty debate would continue beyond this particular case. Reverend Heath emerged from the viewing area emotionally drained. He released a statement about Simpson's final moments. Heath said Simpson was sleepy and ready to go. Simpson met his death with peace and dignity. Heath described Simpson as a kind, gentle man. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think, if it made you question how cases like this happen and whether justice was truly served, then you are exactly the audience this channel was built for. No Way Out goes deeper than the headlines. We do not sensationalize, we do not rush, we tell the full story, from beginning to end, because the people in these cases deserve more than a 5-minute summary. If you have not already, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next documentary. Every subscription helps this channel grow, and every view helps us continue producing content like this. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this story. Leave a comment below and tell us what case you want us to cover next. This has been No Way Out. And for Kendrick Simpson, there was no way out.